On the morning of June 26, 1826, 38-year-old Samuel Willie Jr. stepped out of his house in a remote area of New Hampshire's White Mountain Range called the Notch. His wife, Polly, was at his side, and together they looked around in shock because the land surrounding their home was almost completely destroyed. There had been a huge storm the previous night, and so Sam and Polly had been expecting some damage. But what they were seeing now was far worse than they had imagined. The heavy rain had caused the river in front of their home to completely overflow, so half of their property was now completely submerged in water. The deluge had also triggered a rock slide from one side of the mountain slopes behind them, so there were also rocks and mud and entire trees that were now kind of littering their yard and adjacent fields. Sam saw, luckily, the slide had missed their house and the barn where they kept their livestock, but only barely. And there was damage to those structures from the storm itself that he would have to repair. So Sam began calculating how much time and money it was going to take to clean all this up. And next to him, he heard Polly kind of mumble to herself that this had all been a really bad idea. Sam sighed because he knew that Polly was referring to their decision to move to the Notch in the first place. And right now, staring at all this awful destruction right in front of him, he had to agree with her. This might have been a terrible idea. So up until about a year ago, Sam and Polly and their 5 kids had lived on a farm about 20 miles away from where they were right now, and it had been a very quiet, cozy life. But Sam had always had this feeling that he wanted to do something more exciting than just be a regular old farmer. And with this house in the Notch, he'd seen an opportunity for adventure, and also an opportunity to make some money. So in this part of the White Mountain Range, there was a 12-mile-long road that cut through the range from one side to the other. And the Notch house was right in the middle of that road. But since this was the year 1826, this road was more like a glorified trail. It was mountainous and rocky, and neither horses nor wagons could make it all the way through. So as a result, travelers were typically on foot. And there was literally nowhere to stop on this whole 12-mile road except for the Willie's Notch house. So Sam had realized how valuable this Notch house could be if he converted it into an inn. But he also had bigger aspirations for the place, like beyond it just being a pit stop. He wanted to turn it into a destination. After all, the White Mountains were incredibly beautiful, and where the Willies lived in the Notch was no exception. Their house was right on a riverbank in a mountain valley, surrounded on all sides by the woods and towering mist-covered peaks. It was all honestly breathtaking. And as soon as Sam had seen it, he knew that it could be a famous destination for poets and authors and artists because it was the kind of place people would write songs and books about. I mean, it was perfect. But so far, his dream, of coming out here to the Notch house had been a lot of work. The house was large, but really old, and it had been abandoned for a while before he and his family got there, so it was in really bad shape and quite dilapidated. Sam had hired 2 men to live on the property and help him fix it up, and they'd already done some work to expand the house and the barn to accommodate more travelers. But Sam knew he still had a lot to do before the Notch house became some kind of artist's retreat. And now, with this extensive damage from the most recent storm, he had even more things to fix, which he also had to admit was actually the least of his problems. Because as he and his wife Polly looked around at the aftermath of the storm, he knew really he was lucky that their house was even still standing, and that he and his family were even still alive. I mean, that storm was catastrophic. And as Sam thought about how close they'd come to death, his heart began to race. I mean, he wondered if Polly was right, and they should really at this point just pack the family up and go back to simple farming because it was safer. But leaving meant sort of admitting failure. His big dream would be over. There would be no artist's retreat, no tourist mecca. He would not be some creative benefactor. He'd just be a farmer. So he took a deep breath, and then he asked his wife to please give this place one more chance. He promised he would do everything he possibly could to not just repair the property, but also make it safe and secure so it could withstand whatever the mountain threw at them. And Polly hesitated, but ultimately she believed in her husband, and she nodded in agreement. For the next 2 months, Sam and his 2 hired workers worked practically around the clock repairing the damage from the storm. They fixed up windows and shingles and cleared away all the debris, which took forever. And then once all the repairs were done, Sam continued working, but now he focused on improving the property. As the weeks passed by, He worked very hard to build his family a very secure home so they'd be much safer against future storms. He reinforced walls and built a whole new roof and mapped out disaster scenarios so that he and his family would always be prepared. One disaster scenario that he was especially concerned about was the large boulder that was right behind their house. He was worried that if there was another big rock slide, that boulder might just topple onto them and crush them. And he and his workers soon realized that they couldn't actually move the boulder. It was just way too big. But in the end, they found a very creative way to make sure it would not be dangerous. And while Sam did all this work, he started to feel a lot better about everything. Each security measure he put in place was proof that he didn't have to sacrifice his ambitions for his family's safety. He could have both. A few weeks later, on the night of August 28th, Sam Willie stood by a downstairs window watching another wild storm rage outside. Heavy rain pummeled the glass, and Sam could hear powerful wind battering the sides of the house. It was pitch black out, but every now and then there was a burst of lightning that would light the whole valley up for a few seconds before it went dark again. Each time this happened, a crash of thunder would follow that was so loud it shook the house down to its foundation. Behind Sam, Polly, along with their 5 kids and the 2 men that were working on the property, were all sitting at the kitchen table. And Polly and the kids in particular were very scared, and the whole group were reading Bible verses, in these kind of frantic hushed tones, like they were trying to, will the storm to be over and to cling on to their faith, to pray that they'd be okay. Sam could hear the fear in his wife's voice, and he really couldn't blame her, because this was quite possibly the strongest storm that either of them had ever seen out here. It was even bigger than that one that completely destroyed their property over the summer. The rain seemed impossibly powerful, coming down so hard and so fast that the river had already overflowed. And each time there was a burst of lightning, Sam could see the water levels were getting higher and higher almost by the second. And so Sam was admittedly quite scared himself. He tried to keep that in, but his heart was racing and he was really anxious. But he told himself that this was the moment he'd prepared for all summer long. I mean, this was it. He had done so much work to make sure this was a safe place during storms. And he felt like they'd be okay. But at the same time, the deafening sounds outside and the terrified voices of Polly and his kids were making it really hard to believe that was actually true, that they were really okay here. So for a little while, Sam just kept looking out the window, listening to his family behind him. But then eventually he turned around, and as calm as he could, he told them all to go to bed. It was going to be fine. He would stay up and keep watch. Polly, who was visibly still very scared, nodded and got up and went off with the kids. And for the next few hours, Sam stayed at his post by the window and watched the storm. And for the most part, there wasn't a whole lot of drama. I mean, it was very loud and windy. It was obvious the river was flooding. I mean, there was going to be damage tomorrow, but Sam was thinking that, maybe we're going to get through this thing. But a little after midnight, Sam heard this sudden, extremely loud banging sound outside, and he froze because he knew it was not thunder. It sounded more like an explosion. Almost immediately, Sam knew what it had to have been. The barn must have collapsed. And thinking that this storm had just taken out an entire building that he had reinforced for a storm turned Sam's worry into outright panic. And so Sam screams for his wife and the workers and his kids to wake up, that it's not safe, get away from the windows, we have to find cover. And so for the next few seconds, the family and the workers, everyone's frantically scrambling around, trying to find a safe spot, but they don't know where it is. But as they're sort of navigating, trying to find the right place to go to weather the storm, Sam heard an even louder bang, and then there were screams all around him, and then he felt himself go airborne as a heavy object slammed into his back. The following evening, an exhausted traveler named John Barker walked down that road in the direction of the Notch House where the Willies lived. So John was a merchant, and he was passing through the White Mountains on his way home after a business trip. And he had made this trip many times before. He knew the road, but the road currently was flooded and there was rock slides and damage everywhere, so it was quite slow going and pretty miserable. But he knew at the halfway point was this house, the Notch House, where Sam Willie and his family lived, and they were looking to convert their house into an inn for travelers. And even though it wasn't fully established yet, John knew he could very likely get into that house have a hot meal, rest a little bit before he made the rest of his journey. But when he finally rounded the corner into the valley where the house was, he just froze because the area was a complete disaster. The river had clearly completely flooded, and now half the land in front of him was just underwater. There had also been clearly a huge rock slide. The barn was only half standing, and the field in front of the Willies was completely buried in rocks and mountain debris. But the truly astonishing thing was that in the middle of all this destruction and ruin, the Willies' house was still standing. And as John maneuvered his way closer to it, he realized it was more than just intact. The house was pristine. There wasn't a single thing broken or out of place, not even a window. Relieved and a little amazed, John hurried right up to the entrance and knocked. But no one answered. So eventually he just opened the door and poked his head in and called out to Sam. But he didn't hear anything. No sound of a reply and nobody moving around inside. So John tentatively stepped all the way into the house and just kept calling out to the family as he walked from room to room. But he quickly realized the house was completely empty. It was also a mess. There were clothes scattered all over the floor and beds, and sheets had been yanked around and were messy, and the Bible was wide open on the kitchen table. John stood in the middle of the home trying to work out what could have happened here. The mess suggested that, clearly the family had been here somewhat recently, but had left in a hurry. So John guessed they must have gone down the mountain to wait out the storm somewhere else, either at a neighbor's or the tavern, miles away at the end of the road. And since the Willies were not here to allow him to stay, John needed to figure out what he was going to do. He didn't really like the idea of still sleeping in the home without them here. But he really had nowhere else to go. And it was almost nighttime, and he could barely manage the ruined road during the daylight, let alone during the dark. So even though he felt kind of bad about it, he picked a bed and tried to get some rest. But just as he began to drift off, he heard a deep, guttural moaning sound coming from somewhere outside the house. John immediately woke up and rushed over to a window. But he couldn't see anything. Night came really fast in the White Mountains, and it was almost completely dark outside. He waited to see if he would hear anything else, but he didn't. So he decided he must have imagined the sound and turned to go back to bed. But as he did, the moaning started again, and this time it was louder. John gasped as a terrible thought occurred to him. He wondered if maybe the sound was one of the Willies and that they hadn't actually left the property, but were maybe outside, injured or in trouble because of this storm. So John sprinted outside, but again, it was pitch black outside and he didn't have any kind of light to help guide his way. And so once he was out there, he just began shouting out, calling out to whoever it was, asking if they needed help. And eventually, the horrible moaning answered him. But the moaning kind of echoed all over the valley, so John couldn't pinpoint where it was actually coming from, other than it clearly being outside somewhere. After frantically looking around and not finding whoever it was, John realized that finding the injured person was going to be impossible right now. It was just too dark, and he would unfortunately have to wait until the morning. So, very reluctantly, John went back inside the house, and for hours he just sat in bed and listened to the moaning continue outside. Finally, in the morning, when the first bit of sun peeked over the mountain ridge, John hurried right outside to look around, and this time he quickly found the source of that moaning sound. It was one of the Willies' oxen, moaning in pain from being trapped under some debris near the ruins of their barn. John immediately rushed forward and began hauling the wooden planks and rocks off the ox, and after he had freed the animal, it amazingly staggered to its feet and hobbled away into the woods. It was basically okay. But after it was gone, John felt this sort of sick uneasiness, even though the sound had been from an ox and he had saved it. He just felt like there was something wrong here, and so he decided that he had to go and see the Willies with his own eyes, just to make sure they really were okay. So even though it was really early and John was still very tired, he immediately gathered up his things and set off down the road. Hours later, around noon that same day, John Barker finally staggered out of the mostly destroyed pass and made his way towards the tavern at the bottom of the road. When John stepped inside, he was exhausted, he was drenched, from this awful journey he had just taken again on this road. But more than that, he was really worried about the Willies, because as he made that trip down the road, he saw neighbors' homes along the way and kind of expected to see the Willies in one of them. But no, the Willies were not in any of the neighbors' homes, and in fact, basically none of the neighbors were in their houses either. They were all basically in this tavern. It was like everybody who lived on this road had come to this tavern because of the storm. But when John looked around the tavern, he could tell the Willies were not in there either, and this made John's stomach drop. Because if they weren't at their house, and they weren't in any of the neighbors' homes, and now they were not in this tavern with the rest of their neighbors, that had to mean something was wrong. And so John actually called out to the entire room and asked if anyone had seen the Willies since the storm. And the tavern got really quiet as its occupants all began looking around at each other, seeing if anybody had, but eventually everyone just shook their head and said, no, we don't know where they are. And that's when John said to the crowd that, well, the Willies are missing. A few hours later, a 12-man search party left that tavern and headed right back up the road towards the Notch. They were led by one of the Willies' neighbors, a man named Edward Melcher, who lived at the base of the mountain on a farm with his family. The recent storm had done quite a bit of damage to Edward's property, and so he and his family, like most other people that lived in this area, had gone to the tavern to seek shelter. Edward and his family, much like the Willies, were good people who were just trying to carve out a living in this part of the world. And there were not a lot of people doing that. I mean, this was a very small community, and so they always helped each other out whenever they could. And so this was no exception. But as desperately as Edward and the rest of the search party wanted to get to the Willies' property and find these people, it took so long to navigate the road that by the time they actually got to the property, it was after midnight and really too dark to look for anything. So they just went right into the Willies' house to wait until morning. Once he was inside, Edward could see, the home really was just as John described. It was sort of a mess, but there was absolutely no damage to it from the storm. Edward had heard that Sam was really freaked out about a storm that they had had earlier that summer, and because of that storm and because of the damage it had done, he had gone way out of his way to really develop his property to prepare it for the next storm. And it seemed like all his preparations and reinforcements on his land had paid off because here his house was standing tall. But that was also kind of confusing. It's like, if you prepared this house for a storm, and clearly it was able to withstand the storm, why did the Willies leave? As Edward continued to walk around the house, he saw that the Willies' Bible was still lying on the kitchen table wide open, and when he leaned over and read the passage that was on the page, he couldn't help but, kind of shiver when he saw what it said. It said, "The Lord also thundered in the heavens, and the highest gave his voice, hailstones and coals of fire." Hours later, when the sun finally began to come up, Edward and the others went outside and began searching the property for signs of the Willies. And over the next few hours, the original party of 12 grew as more and more people showed up to assist in the search. By this point, word had spread pretty far about the family's disappearance, and so residents from all over the White Mountains had come here to help. And eventually, hundreds of people were combing the mountainside to find the Willies, or at least to find a clue about where they might have gone. At around noon, when still there had been nothing found, Edward decided he would go search closer to the river, since by this point, the water levels had gone down some. And when he got to the water's edge, he began to hear this strange buzzing sound, and so he followed it, and eventually, he saw something poking out from behind some debris. And when he saw what it was, Edward began to scream for help. So the thing that Sam Willie was most afraid of happening in a large storm was a rock slide, especially with that huge boulder positioned right behind his house. But when Sam realized it was going to be impossible to move said boulder, or otherwise shield his family from falling mountain rocks, he came up with a pretty creative solution. He built a whole second shelter that he and his family could run to if there was a bad storm. And when that second storm hit, the one that had caused all this damage and had led to the Willies' disappearance, well, during that storm, Sam's screaming for his family to, take cover, get away from the windows. He's heard this crashing sound outside that he is convinced is the sound of his barn collapsing, and, his house is next. He's yelling for them to take cover. Well, the family listened to him, and together, they did seek cover. They left the main house and went into that second shelter that they believed was better protected from a potential rock slide. But unfortunately, this would be a catastrophic mistake, because that humongous boulder right behind the house was not actually a safety risk. In many ways, it was like a protective barrier, when there was an actual rock slide during this horrible storm, well, the rubble actually piled up on the backside of that boulder and did not strike the house at all. And so in essence, this boulder basically made the Willies' original home the single safest place to be on the whole property. But unfortunately, Sam and his family did not stay there long enough to realize that. They ran out of the main house as a big group, and as soon as they were outside, they were overtaken by the rock slide and killed. Eventually, the residents of the White Mountains would find the family. The buzzing that Edward heard was actually a group of flies gathered around a single human hand reached out from underneath the rubble. Ultimately, because of this tragedy, the area became a famous tourist destination, just like the Willies had hoped it would. People from all over the country heard about the family and what happened, and before long, artists and authors were coming to the White Mountains in droves to see the site of the tragedy, and some even wrote books about it. And so, in a sort of cruel twist of fate, Sam's dream did come true, just not in the way he hoped. Our next story is called The Burning Room. On one of the last nights in December of 1678, Marie Bosse sat at a large table at a friend's dinner party in the city of Paris, France. The table was crowded with other party guests, and they were all listening to Marie as she told story after story about her life and her career. So Marie was a fortune teller, which meant, at least according to her, that she could read people's futures, usually by reading their palms or using crystals. And Marie was actually quite good at doing this, in the sense that whenever she told someone what their future was going to be, she typically was right, which was why, out of the 400-something fortune tellers in Paris at the time, she had some of the best and most important clients in the whole city. People like royalty and wives of very high-up government members and other very wealthy people of high society. And it was a big deal for Marie to even be in the same room as some of these kinds of people, because she did not come for money. Actually, there was a time where she almost had to live out on the streets, because years ago, when her husband died, she was left alone with her 3 kids and really no way to provide for them. But she'd worked very hard and actually ended up thriving. Her kids had grown up, and she turned her fortune-telling talents into a real business. She'd been so successful that she really was maybe about 3 clients away from being able to retire. And Marie was not one to just sit back and let those clients magically find her. She was a self-made woman and knew it was very important to go out and find those clients herself. And so that's why she was at this party now. It was being hosted by a friend of hers who was also in the fortune-telling scene, and so many of the guests at this table were new potential clients that Marie really hoped to impress. So that's what Marie was trying to do now, to try to be very impressive. She was telling the other guests all these incredible tales about working with the rich and the famous. But the problem was, in addition to these fabulous stories she was telling, what was also coming through very clearly to the audience was that Marie was very drunk. So Marie was loud and talkative in general, and that extroverted attitude really helped her get clients typically. But when she got drunk, she was even more talkative than normal. And sometimes it also made her a bit inappropriate. Right now, though, she felt like she was on a roll, because her stories were drawing gasps and laughs, and the guests were pushing her to tell them more and more. But there was at least one person in the crowd that seemed bothered by what Marie was saying: the hostess of the party. The hostess kept silently glaring at Marie from the other end of the table. It was like she was silently trying to tell her to shut up. But Marie figured she knew why she was acting that way. I mean, the hostess was also a fortune teller, and so she must just be jealous. Marie's getting all this attention and potential new clients, and this wasn't even her party. Like, she just got to be jealous. So Marie ignored the glares and just kept on talking until dinner was over. And then after that, the party ended, and Marie staggered off to bed. When Marie woke up the next day, her head was absolutely pounding and her stomach was in knots. I mean, she was severely hungover from drinking the night before. She didn't remember a whole lot about what had happened the night before, but she did remember telling a lot of stories. And she remembered that while she was telling these stories, the hostess was angrily glaring at her the whole time. And now that she was sober, a terrible thought popped into her head. She wondered if she'd said or done something that was embarrassing. What if the table wasn't laughing with her? What if they were laughing at her? And what if, the hostess glaring at her was some sort of signal to stop because she was hurting herself? And so this thought that, somehow she had done real damage to her reputation, her career, from being too drunk, continued to weigh on her throughout the entire day and into the following evening, until that night when she was in her kitchen making some dinner with her adult daughter, and there was a knock at her door. Marie hurried to open it up, and when she did, she found a young woman standing on her front steps. The woman seemed incredibly nervous and kept fidgeting and smoothing her hair, and she told Marie that she had gotten her name from someone Marie had met at that dinner party and was hoping that Marie could help her. And when she heard this, Marie smiled and exhaled out all the tension she'd been holding up over the last day. This was a huge relief to Marie. It was proof that the dinner party had not been a total embarrassment, despite the hostess glaring at her the whole time. That clearly, here she is getting a new client. She must have impressed at least this woman, and maybe there were more, like it had been a success. So very excitedly, she invited the young woman inside and led her to the area of her home where Marie conducted her business and read people's fortunes. This room had lots of strange objects placed all around it, like jars and crystals and bottles of potions and decks of cards to make the area feel mystical and authentic. The two of them eventually sat down at Marie's small table in the middle of this room, and once they were sitting, the woman told Marie that she did want her fortune told because she had a terribly abusive husband, and she wanted to know how much longer she would have to put up with his cruelty. This didn't surprise Marie. She'd seen a lot of nervous, frail women like this one who were completely trapped in their marriages. In France at this time, divorce wasn't even legal, which meant you were stuck with your partner even if they were abusive. And so a lot of these women that were in this position turned to Marie, desperate to be told what the rest of their lives looked like, and if their lives would continue to be terrible and hard because of their partner. Marie knew that really what these women were looking for was control. They hoped that if they just knew what their future looked like, even if it was bad, they could somehow do something to change it. And so Marie, she reached out and she grabbed this woman's hand and she turned it around and she began to study her palm. Marie was trying to get a sense of what the future held for this woman by reading her palm. And pretty soon, Marie got this feeling in her gut. She felt sure that this woman actually was going to be okay. And Marie told the woman that her husband's abuse would end soon. Then she gave her some tips on what to do in the meantime. The woman was visibly relieved and thanked Marie profusely, and then when she was gone, Marie smiled. Not just because she had helped this woman, but also because, after this job, Marie would only need 2 more clients before she had enough money to retire. A few days later, on January 4th, Marie woke up to somebody banging on her door. She figured it must be a very desperate client, so she rolled out of bed and started walking to go answer it. But before she could get there, the door flew open and the Parisian police poured inside. Marie staggered back and just stared at them in complete shock. She had no idea what they were doing there, but they immediately just grabbed her and said she was under arrest. Marie screamed in protest and said there had to be some mistake here. She hadn't done anything wrong. And when they didn't listen to her, she got furious and demanded to be released. She told them that she was Marie Boss, and she had friends in high places like Parliament and noble circles. They could vouch for her and say that she was an honest person who just worked hard and was good for her clients and good for the city. But as she was ranting and raving, one of the officers stepped in front of her, and without reacting to what she was saying, they just showed her an object that Marie instantly recognized as having come from her fortune-telling room. And at this, her heart sank and she stopped struggling, because Marie knew that she was now in very, very big trouble. And if she was in trouble, then so were many, many other people in Paris. After Marie was arrested, she was brought to a prison in Paris called the Bastille, where she was interrogated by torture. And since Marie was already a talker, she quickly told the police everything they wanted to know. And after Marie did that, all hell broke loose. Hordes of police officers fanned out through the whole city, charging into homes and businesses all around Paris, arresting civilians, business owners, and housewives. Then they flooded the hall of the city's government and demanded high-ranking officials in parliament surrender their wives to authorities, throwing the Parisian government into absolute chaos. And even after all of that, the authorities still weren't finished. they left the city and began forcing the French nobility out of their castles to go face charges in the city. Months turned into years, and the arrests continued to pile up, and each one was more shocking than the last, until the investigation led authorities to the actual royal palace in Paris and to the king's favorite mistress. By the time the police finished their investigation, hundreds of people all across France, ranging from commoners to literal royalty, were either facing charges or sitting in jail cells. And screams filled the halls of these prisons as the arrested were tortured for whatever information they might have. Scores of people fled the country, and then eventually, all around Paris, these enormous pyres were built in the public squares. And one by one, dozens and dozens of people were led out to these pyres, strapped to the poles in the middle of them, and then burned to death in front of thousands of Parisian spectators. And it was all because of Marie. So Marie Bosse was not just a fortune teller. She made her real money by making and selling poison. And it would turn out that she was not the only one. In fact, at the time, you could say Paris basically ran on poison. Since the late 1660s, according to one estimate, around half of the people who lived in that city, from housewives to literal royalty, had poisoned someone or been poisoned by someone. It had become absurdly common for people, especially rich people, to buy poison from Marie and the network of 400 or so other poisoners around the city and use it to quietly commit murder so that the victims' deaths looked natural. But poison was not just used to kill people. It was sort of used like a solution for many kinds of problems, like people who wanted their romantic interests to be easier to seduce, well, they'd buy poison and poison them. Or people that had abusive or unappealing partners, they would use poison to make them sick and bedridden, because remember, they can't get divorced. So if you're stuck with somebody and you don't like them, well, just poison them. It was also alleged that King Louis XIV himself was poisoned in non-fatal doses by his mistress, who wanted to make him easier to manipulate. Poison was even used for entertainment. One duo of poisoners baked deadly substances into cakes and handed them out to unsuspecting patients at a local hospital just to see what would happen. The poison affair, as it came to be called, was without a doubt at the time Paris's biggest and best kept secret, until Marie went to that dinner party, got really drunk, and let it slip. That night, Marie told stories of poisoning people, and people thought they were so funny because they didn't believe they were true. But one of the guests saw that the hostess of the party looked furious at Marie the whole time Marie was telling these stories. And so he wondered if maybe what Marie was talking about might actually be real, and the hostess is kind of trying to signal her to stop talking about it, but Marie was not taking the hint. So the following day, that dinner guest went to the police, and the police sent a woman to Marie's house to act as an undercover spy to see if maybe she could get proof that the poisonings were real. And lo and behold, when this woman told Marie that her husband was abusive and she just wanted to know how long this was going to go on for, Marie, read her palm and read her future, but then also gave her some tips about what to do in the meantime, which included handing her a vial of poison and saying, just go ahead and kill your husband, poison him. The object that officer had shown Marie when she was arrested was that poison. The investigation into the poison affair lasted for 3 years, and during that time, there were over 300 people who got arrested, from commoners to royalty. 23 of those people were banished, and 34 people were executed, including Marie Bosse. She was actually the first person to be burned alive on one of those pyres. On the night of August 25th, 2011, a 23-year-old woman named Risa Demura, along with her husband, Hiroki Demura, were sitting on their couch in their apartment in Kanazawa City, Japan, watching TV. And as they sat there, they both found themselves laughing hysterically at the screen. They were watching their favorite show. It was this hidden camera comedy prank show, and this was like the highlight of their day, sitting here together on the couch and just laughing their heads off. Risa and Hiroki had been married for just 4 months, and so they were still very much living in that newlywed bliss period, where they basically spent every second they could together. When Hiroki wasn't working, the two of them would go out to eat, they would go to the movies together, or take trips to the beach, since Kanazawa City was right on the coast. And whenever they were out, they were always talking about how lucky they felt, that they had found each other and that they were married and that the rest of their lives were going to look like this. Like, how lucky were they? Risa and Hiroki had actually met when they were young kids in middle school, but Hiroki was very shy and really didn't speak to Risa at all at the time. But then later, as adults after college, they ran into each other, and Hiroki, he told Risa the truth, that he actually had always loved her, and he still did. And Risa really had been shocked by this because she had always felt a type of way about him, but it really didn't seem like he was interested in her. So this was like this amazing revelation. But more than that, it was also just incredibly romantic to her, like a classic Hollywood love story. And so when he had confessed his love to her, she had pretty much immediately said, "Oh my gosh, let's go on a date. This is awesome. Let's do it." And from there, it had just been a whirlwind. They had just fallen completely in love, and then within the year, they had gotten married. Now, the reason they had ultimately settled in Kanazawa City was mostly just because of Hiroki's job. He worked at a company that was in the city, and he was also kind of a rising star there. Every time Risa met one of his coworkers, they would talk about how, he was such a hard worker and what a natural-born leader he was. And so Risa was very proud of him. But more than that, she felt inspired by Hiroki. And so she found herself wanting to find a really fulfilling job herself. And so she was on the hunt for, her career. But for right now, Risa was very much still in the sort of identifying what she wanted to do phase. And it was because she was just kind of always going from one interest to another because she just had this huge, insatiable curiosity and loved trying new things, which made it hard to choose just one thing to do with her life. But Hiroki was incredibly supportive of this. I mean, he treated Risa like she was royalty, and he always said that whatever she wanted to do was completely fine by him as long as she was happy. But for right now, as Risa sat on the couch next to Hiroki watching this funny show, she found her mind wandering away from the show and away from her ongoing job search to Hiroki's birthday. It was coming up, and she just felt like there was a lot of pressure on her to do something really special for him. Mostly because Hiroki always did something really thoughtful and really incredible for her. Like, he really celebrated her really well. And she didn't want to kind of underwhelm him. And this was also going to be the first time one of them was having a birthday now that they were officially married. So Risa really wanted to go all out and plan something really great that Hiroki would never forget. But as Risa sat on the couch next to her husband trying to come up with the perfect birthday celebration idea, she just kept drawing a blank. It's like the only thing she could think of that really she and her husband shared was they both were very romantic people. And so this would have to be romantic in some way, but how, she didn't know. And in many ways, she and her husband were very different in how they showed affection or how they showed romance. Hiroki was still a very quiet and reserved person, so his displays of affection to his wife were reserved and private. But Risa, on the other hand, was massively extroverted, full of energy, and so her displays of affection were sort of over the top and big and boisterous. And so Risa is just really struggling, trying to think, like, how can I do this? And it was like all of a sudden she has this epiphany, and she sees in her mind's eye the perfect way to celebrate his birthday. She didn't even know what inspired it, but it came to her. She would take her husband out on a very romantic beach walk, but then at the end of the beach walk, there would be this surprise over-the-top fireworks display. It was exactly what she needed. It was romantic and crazy, just like her. 2 days later, on Saturday afternoon, Risa, along with 6 of her friends, were at Osaki Beach, which is the beach where the big birthday was going to take place, and the birthday was going to be that night. But now that Risa had planned out the big party, she had done that the day before while Hiroki was at work, now on the day of, she actually had some physical setup to do, because this was not just going to be a walk on the beach, there was also going to be fireworks, and so she needed her friends for that. And so what they were doing on this day is they were walking along the beach looking for the perfect spot that would afford Risa and her husband some privacy on the beach, so it was very romantic, but also had like a vantage point for the friends where they could basically hide and watch the couple and look for the signal to then light off the fireworks when it was the right time. And so Risa and her friends, they're walking along the beach, and then they see it. There's this kind of private, sort of secluded section of the beach that had this row of shrubbery kind of lining the backside of it. that would be a perfect spot for the friends to hide, and then also down on the beach would be nice and private and peaceful. And they thought that was the best spot to have this big party. And so over there they go, the friends go up into the bushes and they get their fireworks ready. And then Risa, she went down to the sand section of the beach and she kind of prepped the area where she and Hiroki would be. And then ultimately she laid out this blue sheet. And then once that was in place, she walked back up to her friends and they said, okay, we're ready to go. And so Risa told her friends her plan was to be there that night at 10 p.m. with her husband and that the friends should actually get there a little bit earlier to be all set up. And they agreed, and then they all left. As Risa left the beach, she found herself feeling incredibly antsy. I mean, she was so excited about this big surprise party that night, and she just wanted it to be 10 p.m. so she could finally reveal what she had in store for Hiroki. But she also knew she couldn't give away that she had this big surprise. And so when she got home, where Hiroki was, she acted like everything was totally normal. And so when she walked inside, she quickly sent Hiroki to the couch to go relax, while she made them both a very nice dinner. And then when she was done, the two of them sat down at the table and Risa kind of pretended like she had nothing planned. And she was like, hey, what should we do this weekend to celebrate your birthday? And they talked about, going and seeing friends and, going out, whatever they were going to do. But it was all a big ruse. Risa had her big plan for the night. And then at some point, when it was getting kind of late and it seemed like Hiroki was maybe thinking about going to bed, Risa said, well, wait a minute. It's your birthday weekend. Let's not go to bed right now. Let's go on a beach walk. What a great idea that would be. And Hiroki was kind of surprised, but he's like, actually, yeah, that sounds great. Let's go for it. And as soon as he said that, Risa could barely contain her excitement because she knew she had this awesome thing planned for him down at the beach, and it was about to happen. Like, this was going to be awesome. And so she and her husband quickly cleaned up, and then just before 10 p.m., they left their apartment and got in the car and headed to the beach. About 10 minutes later, they parked at the end of this dead-end road right near the beach. And when they got out, there was basically bushes on all sides of the road, but there was this little path that cut through the bushes that led down to the sand. But as Risa led Hiroki down this path, she quickly realized she had a big problem. There was virtually no moonlight. It's like basically pitch black on the beach. And remember, she had put out that blue blanket to signify where she and Hiroki would be, in position so that her friends who were nearby in the bushes could light off the fireworks. It was all contingent on getting to that blue blanket. And it's so dark that not only was Risa unable to see this blue blanket, certainly not from a distance, but she could barely see the sand. It's so dark, it's like eerie out on the beach. And this is in 2011 when you couldn't just pull out your cell phone and turn on your flashlight. There was no flashlight feature. And so the best they could do was basically pull out their phone, tap on the screen, and use the little bit of light coming from that to guide their way. But after walking on the beach just a short ways, Hiroki actually stopped Risa and said, hey, I don't think it's safe to be walking on the beach. We really can't see where we're going. Let's go back and get a flashlight. But Risa knows her friends are already in position in those shrubs down the beach, ready to light off those fireworks, and they likely can't see very well. And so she's worried that if she doesn't get there soon, that somehow her friends are going to panic and light off the fireworks prematurely. She doesn't know what's going to happen here, but she's starting to get worried that everything's falling apart and she can't afford to be late. And so she tells her husband, no, let's not go back and get flashlights. Let's just walk on the dark sand. It's no big deal. And so the two of them are walking along the beach using their cell phone screens to guide them. But pretty quickly, Hiroki started to notice that Risa seemed really anxious and was walking really too fast. This is meant to be a peaceful walk on the beach, and Risa is like a woman on a mission here, trying to go somewhere, but he doesn't understand where she's trying to go. She's just walking really quickly ahead of him. And finally, he said to her, hey, what's going on? Why are you trying to walk so quickly? What are we doing out here? And so finally, she just stops. And she looks at her husband and she's about to tell him what's actually going on because she feels like, the surprise at this point is ruined and she basically needs his help if they're going to find this blanket and figure out where they need to be. But right as Risa is about to tell her husband what's going on, suddenly it was like the whole world went completely black. No more ambient light from cell phones, no more minimal moonlight, nothing. Absolute blackness and silence. At the same time, Risa's friends were actually not that far away up in the bushes. But much like Risa and Hiroki, they had also been dealing with the issue that they basically couldn't see anything. It was so dark. And so they got in position, but they basically couldn't even see the sand. I mean, they had no idea if Risa and Hiroki were in position or not, but they could hear Risa and Hiroki talking. They could hear them sort of out there somewhere on the sand. And the friends were kind of whispering back and forth, like, how are we going to know when they're actually in position to light off the fireworks? How are we going to get the signal? We can't see them. And so the friends are sort of like unsure what to do, and they're straining their eyes out onto the sand, trying to see Risa, trying to see Hiroki, but again, they can't see them. They can't see the blue blanket, even though it's not that far away. And so they're just like looking and listening, and they can kind of tell that Risa and Hiroki are probably the voices they're hearing, and they appear to be moving in this direction. But then suddenly they start hearing these screams coming from the same direction they were hearing voices that they believed were their friends. And at first they thought the screams might actually be the signal, like light off the fireworks. But the screams, they sounded like somebody was in trouble. And critically, as soon as the screaming started, it abruptly stopped. It was like high-pitched, just awful screams, and then silence. Absolute total silence on the beach. And again, they can't see anything. So they don't know what's going on. They don't even know if that's actually Risa and Hiroki, but they think something's wrong here. So they abandon the fireworks, they leave their hiding spot, and they charge out onto the beach, and they're looking all around, but they really can't see anything. They can't even find the blue blanket, and they knew roughly where it was. They couldn't even find that. And so they're running around the beach, they're calling out to Hiroki and to Risa, but they're not hearing anything back. And for 30 minutes, they're just running around looking for their friends, just knowing like something bad has happened here. And then at some point, one of the friends doubles back and they go roughly to the area where, Risa and Hiroki were supposed to be, near that blue blanket, and they make a discovery. It would turn out, when Risa and Hiroki were out on that beach walking around in the darkness, Risa actually did find that blue sheet that she'd set up in preparation for this big birthday surprise. Except it was so dark that even though they were literally at this point standing on the blanket, she and Hiroki couldn't tell. It was that dark. Now, that doesn't seem like that would be catastrophic until you consider what was underneath that blanket. So 2 days earlier, when Risa had that epiphany of how she could have the best birthday ever for Hiroki, she had had that epiphany in part because of the show they were watching on TV, the hidden camera comedy show that she and Hiroki both loved. The show was called Arashi's Big Secret, and its comedy really came from the over-the-top pranks that the show's hosts would pull on Japanese celebrities. And one of those pranks was to dig a large hole on the beach that somebody would accidentally fall into. And so Risa thought, what a great idea. What if I dig a hole on the beach, cover it up, and then after our romantic walk on the beach for his birthday, I'll have Hiroki fall into the hole, and then my friends will fire off those fireworks, and it'll be sort of like he's on the game show that we love so much. It'll basically be like a combination of a romantic, fun time on the beach and a prank and a big birthday celebration afterwards. It was perfect. However, Risa made a terrible miscalculation. So on the game show, when they would dig these holes in the beach, they would cover them with basically dried foam, like think styrofoam, that the instant one of their contestants or their celebrities stepped directly on the foam would break and they would fall feet first into the hole. What Risa did is after she dug this deep hole along with her friends, getting ready for this big party, she covered the hole first with a thick piece of plastic, like almost like plywood, but plastic, like rigid plastic. And so she covered the hole with that. That was like the platform. And then she covered that with the blue sheet so that to the naked eye, it looked like the ground was level underneath the blue sheet. In Risa's mind, this rigid plastic would break the instant her husband stepped on it. Like it wasn't that strong. It was maybe strong enough to hold him for a second, but it would definitely snap in the middle and he would fall in, just like on the game show. But in reality, when she and her husband inadvertently walked onto that blue sheet without realizing it because it was so dark, that piece of plastic didn't break. It was too rigid. The plastic, instead of breaking, just kind of tilted suddenly to one side, causing Risa and her husband to suddenly tumble basically forward, both of them, head first into this hole, and caused this massive avalanche of sand to come into the hole and completely cover the two of them up. And so Risa and Hiroki, they screamed for a second as they began to fall into the ground, and then suddenly they're upside down and completely covered all the way to the top by heavy, wet sand. That's why it went silent after the screams, because they were completely buried alive. Risa's friends ultimately, after walking around the beach after hearing those screams, they would find the blue blanket, and it was partially submerged in the sand. And so they really didn't know what had happened, but because of the screams and what they were seeing, they just called the authorities. And they came out to the beach, and it would take them like 30 minutes to finally dig out Risa and Hiroki from this hole. But by that point, it was too late. They both had suffocated to death. The next and final story of today's episode is called Excellent. One morning in the winter of 1856, a 27-year-old explorer named Dr. Edward Fogel sat down for breakfast at the home where he was staying in the city of Abashir, which was in a kingdom called Wadai in Central Africa. Edward poured himself a cup of milk, and then, even though the table was full of warm breads and cakes and porridge, Edward called a servant over and asked her to get him a plate of boiled eggs. But the servant just apologized and said, "I'm sorry, but we don't have any eggs this morning. We're all out." Edward was disappointed, but, he thanked the servant anyways. So Edward was visiting Africa from Germany on a map-making expedition, and he'd been there for the past 2 weeks. And so far, all the local food really upset his stomach, except for eggs. So for literally every single meal, the only thing he ate was eggs. And now, because they were out of eggs, despite there being all this other food to choose from, he knew he couldn't eat it without getting sick, and so he would just have to go hungry. But outside of the food, overall, Edward thought the city of Abashir was okay. He had gotten to meet the king, who had arranged for him to stay here in this very nice home that was owned by a noble family. And the area itself was extremely beautiful. And Edward was actually going to be the very first European to successfully make a map of it, which meant that he'd be essentially creating history. But Edward just really was not getting along with the locals. They just seemed kind of overall pretty suspicious of him. And, Edward couldn't believe it, but, they didn't seem to care at all that he was this famous map maker who had come all the way there from Germany to literally put their kind of insignificant city onto the map of the whole world. Like, why didn't they appreciate that? He couldn't believe it. And now, adding insult to injury, Edward also couldn't even eat any breakfast. And so, feeling pretty annoyed, despite all the effort clearly people had made to feed him that morning, Edward stood up from the table and he left to go spend the day exploring. He walked into the front courtyard, where another servant was waiting with Edward's horse. Edward spent most of his days in the city just kind of riding around and drawing maps of streets and alleyways. But today, this servant warned Edward that he really ought to stay inside, because it was not safe for him to go out into the city. So at this point in time, the kingdom that Abashir was a part of was at war with several nations. And so as a result, everybody in the city was very worried about spies, which meant they were very suspicious of foreigners, like Edward. Now, for the most part, locals had sort of put up with his presence so far, but to them, it just sort of seemed like he was always watching them without ever talking to anyone, and so they had started to gossip. But Edward, after being given this warning by the servant, did not take it seriously. Instead, he kind of scoffed and said, it's no big deal. Like, I'm not going to be out there for very long anyways. Nothing's going to happen. He said he had another plan for today. His big plan was he would leave the city of Abashir and he would go to this nearby mountain, and he wanted to climb up it and get a bird's eye view of the city from the mountaintop to help him finish up his map. But when Edward said that, the servant looked truly horrified and told Edward that he simply could not do that. because the mountain Edward was clearly talking about was sacred, and nobody was allowed to climb it. Like, that was really important to the people who lived here. But to Edward, this warning really did not land. Instead, he just looked at it as more evidence that the locals just didn't appreciate what he was doing for them. Like, he was on a very important mission that was far more important than anything sacred to them. And so Edward, he thanked the servant for his warning, but also said, look, I'm going to do what I'm going to do because this is really important, and so I'm going to go hike that mountain, and I'll see you tonight when I drop off the horse. And then Edward climbed onto the horse, and he rode off. But Edward didn't come back. He didn't come back that night, or the day after, or the day after, and pretty soon it was clear that Edward was missing. Word of Edward's disappearance ultimately made it back to Germany pretty quickly, specifically to the Geography Society that had sent him to Africa on this map-making mission in the first place. So the Geography Society and the German public sent several search parties to Africa to go look for Edward. But despite multiple serious attempts over several years, nobody ever found him or figured out what happened to him. And because of this, Edward sort of became famous in Germany. People began to see him as this brave explorer who thirsted for knowledge and went daringly into the unknown. They imagined dramatic and tragic things that might have happened to him, like maybe he had been assassinated or taken prisoner, or maybe he discovered something holy or ancient that he wasn't supposed to see. And so in time, the story of Edward got bigger and bigger, and he became like a symbol of, German pride. I mean, this was our explorer. He had done something amazing, clearly. Also, adding intrigue to this already very bizarre mystery was the fact that all the people who actually went to Africa to look for Edward, the search parties over the years, literally everybody who went died. Now, all those searchers, they know how they died. It was local violence or disease or just plain bad luck. But it sort of added intrigue to this mystery. Everybody who went looking for Edward didn't come back. That became part of the lore. And so this mystery just continued to grow and get passed around, and things were embellished and things were fictionalized until finally, almost 20 years after Edward disappeared, another explorer named Gustav Nachtigall decided he was going to be the one who finally figured out once and for all what actually happened to this guy. And so in the early winter of 1874, Gustav is now in the courtyard outside of his apartment in Abashir, because he had actually gone to Africa to begin his search for, the answer here, what happened to Edward. And he's standing in this courtyard along with his translator, whose name was Ahmed. And the two of them were sitting across from an elderly man who was friends with the current king of Abashir. And this elderly man had at one point lived in one of the apartments across the courtyard. And so Gustav asked this old man if he had ever met with a European man about 17 years earlier. And Ahmed translated the question to him. And the old man said yes, he had. That one European man had come to meet with the king around that time, and he had always been writing in this notebook, but he had never seemed to want to speak to anybody and had for the most part kept to himself. But the old man said, beyond his impression of this guy, he really didn't know anything about him. He had no idea, what he was doing or what happened to him. So at this point, both Gustav and Ahmed had been in Abashir for 2 months now. And in that time, they had been trying to ask around and see if anybody remembered Edward. And so far, they had run into a few people who seemed to remember him, like this older man, because it was pretty rare to see a European person in the city. But unfortunately, nobody had any information on how or when Edward disappeared. Or, in the rare case that they did seem to know more, they refused to talk about it. And so for Gustav, on the one hand, this was incredibly frustrating because all he wanted was just the truth here. But on the other hand, as he ran into more and more people that did seem apprehensive to talk about Edward at all, that sort of seemed to suggest that maybe something really bad did happen to Edward when he was in Abashir. And if that was the case, if some horrible fate befell him, Gustav knew there was one person in this city who almost certainly would know the truth. But Gustav basically couldn't ask this one person any questions about Edward without being incredibly offensive. Because this one person was the current king of Abashir, King Ali. And it would have been his father who had met Edward and arranged for him to stay with that noble family when he was doing his map-making thing. And so for Edward to have been killed or captured, or if something horrible happened to him while he was in Abashir, well, King Ali's father would have had to have given the okay, or would have at least known about it and maybe been okay with it. Like, he would have known something making him complicit in some way with whatever happened to Edward. And so to ask King Ali, what do you think happened to Edward? You could be potentially suggesting that his dad did something terrible. But more than that, what Ahmed had told Gustav was that you don't just risk offending the king by asking those questions. You might actually be executed for offending the king. And so what Gustav decided he needed to do here, because he was so dead set on trying to figure out this mystery, is he still needed to find a way to talk to King Ali about Edward, but without losing his life. He had to come up with a clever way to get this information out of the king. A few weeks later, and Gustav and Ahmed had still not yet come up with the clever way to speak to the king yet. Like, they didn't have a way to approach the subject without horribly offending the king. And so the two of them were in Gustav's apartment eating lunch when suddenly there was a knock at the door. And so Gustav got up, he went to the door, and when he opened it up, it was this courier who told Gustav that he was part of a caravan that had just arrived here from North Africa, and he had some mail for Gustav from back home, so letters from Germany. And he just handed the bundle of mail to Gustav. And Gustav, who did not get mail very often, was very excited, and he said, "Oh, thank you." He took the mail, thanked the guy, shut the door, and he went back into the common room, and he just began going through the mail and just looking to see who had sent him something. And as he was doing it, he suddenly had this great idea. It had nothing to do with what was written in the letters. It was just the concept of receiving mail suddenly gave him this great way to talk to the king. The very next day, Gustav and Ahmed walked into the royal palace in Abashir. And when they walked in, they eventually made their way into this bright and airy courtroom. And in this courtroom, on the other end against the wall, was King Ali sitting on a throne. And so Gustav and Ahmed immediately go over to the king and they greet him and they exchange some pleasantries. And as they're doing that, Gustav, he knew that caravan that had come through the day before from North Africa with, Gustav's mail, had also made a stop at the palace and presented the king with all these gifts, like a silver tea set and gold watches and all this luxurious fabric. And so Gustav was really hoping that those gifts had put the king in a really good mood, because that was a big part of his plan here. At some point, after, the pleasantries had stopped, Gustav actually referenced the caravan and told the king that, in fact, they had also swung by his place and dropped off this big bundle of letters from back home. And he said he was really happy about it. And the king kind of seconded that and said, "Oh yeah, they gave me all these great gifts. Like, yeah, it's so wonderful." And so they're kind of talking back and forth about how great this mail delivery was, when Gustav tells this incredible lie to the king. He tells the king, he goes, "All those letters, it was really great to hear from home, from my friends, from my family. But there was this one really weird letter in there that I didn't even know who it was from." Now, this letter didn't exist. This was a total fabrication. But he told the king that this weird letter, it was from this elderly man who had written to Gustav to tell him that his son had gone to Abashir many years ago and not come home again. And so now the elderly man, he knew his son was probably not alive at this point. But in this letter to Gustav, this fictional letter to Gustav, he told Gustav that his son had done a lot of writing in notebooks. And he was hopeful that maybe someone in Abashir had these notebooks. And could Gustav get the notebooks and return them to the old man to give him some comfort about, what his son had been doing and saying and thinking before he disappeared. As soon as Gustav said this, he could actually feel the mood in the throne room shift, and he could tell that King Ali was very much on edge about what Gustav might say next. But Gustav had planned for this, and he told the king that, just so you know, all throughout Europe, people think of you as a wise and just king. And so if by chance you have these notebooks and you were to give them to me so I can give them to this elderly man in his old age so he can have some comfort before he dies, if you would do that, the people of Europe would love you even more for that simple act of kindness." Then Gustav went quiet, and there was really intense silence in the throne room. But then the king just kind of sat back in his throne, and he smiled at Gustav. And as soon as Gustav saw that smile on the king's face, he decided he's just got to do it. And he said to the king, "The son's name is Dr. Edward Fogel." And then after that, Gustav just went silent, because he knew at this point, if the king thought he was lying, he could easily be executed right now. But King Ali just kept on smiling at Gustav and just said, "You know what? I'll think about it." Gustav quickly thanked the king and hurried out of the throne room, and then he went back to his apartment and spent the entire night just pacing around his room, wondering what was going to happen. Part of Gustav was optimistic that maybe the king would come through here and hand over these notebooks if he really did have them. But the other part of Gustav, the more realistic side, is maybe what he had just done is effectively signed his own death warrant, and that soon he'd become one of the many travelers who came to Abashir and never went home. A few days later, a very nervous Gustav followed a palace guard back into the throne room. And when he got in there, he immediately saw King Ali sitting on his throne, and Gustav really couldn't read his expression, so he didn't know if the king was mad at him, if he was going to be conciliatory, if he was going to help him. He had no idea. And so Gustav just walked into the room and kind of held his breath. King Ali broke the silence, and when he did, it was clear he was not angry. He was just kind of even keel. And he told Gustav that after their conversation, he had gone and spoken to the noble family that Edward had stayed with when he was here. But they told him they couldn't find any of Dr. Edward's writings, and so they had either been thrown away or lost. And so unfortunately, there was nothing to send back to Edward's elderly father. Now, Gustav did not believe this, because at this time, paper was very scarce. So there was no way they would have been throwing it away or destroying it. I mean, paper was pretty valuable. But he couldn't say that to the king, so he just swallowed his disappointment and thanked the king for asking about the notebooks, and then Gustav hoped that at this point he'd be allowed to leave. But one of the guards put their hand on Gustav's shoulder and said he needed to follow him. And at this point, Gustav's stomach dropped because he assumed he was about to go be punished for asking about Edward in the first place. And so Gustav's hands were shaking and his heart was racing as he followed the guard out of the palace and out into the courtyard, where there were some horses tied up and waiting for them. Gustav felt nauseous as he followed the guard through the city streets, and he wondered if he should just try to make a break for it and try to escape. But he looked down different streets and alleys and realized that would be totally useless, because the palace guards would find him, so there was nowhere for him to go. And so Gustav had no choice but to just keep on following this guard. And so through the city they went, and then eventually they got to the city gates, and Gustav was horrified as they left the city and just began riding out into the wilderness over towards this huge mountain in the distance. And as they're making their way towards this mountain, all Gustav is thinking is, at any moment here, they're going to just dump me here to die, or they're going to ambush me, or something bad's going to happen to me. At some point, the guard led Gustav all the way to the foot of that mountain. And there, the guard abruptly stopped and climbed off his horse and just turned around and faced Gustav. And he says, "I'm going to tell you exactly what happened to Edward." And Gustav was kind of shocked by this. He really didn't know what was going to happen here. Again, he doesn't even know if he's in danger at this point. But now he's just holding his breath, waiting for potentially this mystery to finally be solved. And so the guard, he looked at Gustav and he said, "Edward committed an unforgivable crime, and he was punished for that crime." Now, at this point, Gustav was shocked because Edward was like this very well-traveled and highly respected guy, and it didn't make sense that he would commit any crime, let alone an unforgivable one that apparently cost him his life. And so Gustav kind of blurted out, like, "What crime? What did he do?" The guard explained that from day one, Edward had made lots of enemies in Abashir. He basically spent his days riding all around the city and staring at everybody and writing in his notebooks, but never talking to anybody. And so people began to gossip that maybe he was a spy. And then also the guard said Edward had climbed their sacred mountain despite being told not to, the mountain that was literally right behind them. And then also the guard said Edward was just totally unpleasant and just kind of a snobby person that nobody liked. But the guard said, none of that is actually what caused Edward to be punished. Edward's unforgivable crime, the one that caused his downfall, was his insatiable hunger for eggs. At every single meal, he refused all the food his noble host prepared for him and demanded eggs. In Abashir, eggs were quite rare and considered a precious gift, and Edward demanded them every single meal, and he ate all of that noble family's eggs. And so eventually the nobles, they could not stand Edward's disrespect, and so they went to the king. And the king, who agreed this was just awful what Edward had done, decided the only appropriate punishment was to take Edward and drag him out to the base of that sacred mountain and literally beat him to death. Dr. Edward Vogel, the proud symbol of Germany's exploring spirit, was executed because he ate an offensive number of eggs. Gustav was unharmed. He, unlike Edward, had actually bothered to learn the local customs and was highly respectful, and so he was allowed to leave the city, even after being told what happened to Edward. And he would become the first European ever to leave Abashir alive. As for Edward's notebooks and maps, they were never found.